My name is Cora Dean. For most of my 28 years, I've considered myself a student of quiet things. The way dust motes dance in a sliver of afternoon light, the subtle shift in a person's breathing when they're about to tell a lie, the precise shade of blue the sky turns just before a storm. I live in a small apartment in a city far enough from my childhood home to feel like a choice, but close enough that the guilt can still travel the distance. I'm a cartographer by trade, but not of landscapes. I map ancestral migration patterns, tracing the faint, spidery lines of families across continents and centuries. It's a job of patience and precision, of finding stories in the spaces between documented facts. Perhaps it's no surprise that I've spent so much of my life trying to map the geography of my own family, a terrain of shifting borders and unspoken treaties. The story I need to tell begins, as so many of our family stories do, on Christmas morning. The air in my parents' house always smelled the same on that day, a potent, almost cloying blend of pine needles from the towering fir in the living room, my mother's spiced cider simmering on the stove, and the faint, ever-present scent of rain-scented potpourri she kept in porcelain bowls, a scent that clung to the furniture like a memory. My father, Arthur, was stoking the fire, his movements economical and precise, as if he were performing a necessary but unfulfilling task. My mother, Helen, glided around the room, a whirlwind of red cashmere and practiced cheer, adjusting ornaments that were already perfectly placed. And then there was Stella. My sister, younger by 3 years, arrived in a flurry of perfectly tousled blonde hair and apologies that sounded more like announcements. The traffic was just a nightmare. "I'm so sorry," she'd said, kissing both my parents on the cheek while I received a brief, airy wave from across the room. She was the sun around which our family had always orbited. I was a distant, quiet moon, content to reflect a little of her light, because it was easier than trying to generate my own. We settled into the familiar ritual of gift-giving. My father handed out presents with the solemnity of a bank teller distributing funds. My mother provided a running commentary of oohs and ahs, her voice a finely tuned instrument of maternal delight. Stella's pile of gifts was, as always, a mountain of glossy paper and shimmering ribbon. Mine was a small, respectable hill. I'd learned long ago not to measure love by the square footage of wrapping paper, but the disparity was a landscape in itself, a map of its own. "Oh, this one's for you, darling," Helen said, her voice lilting with anticipation as she handed Stella a small, elegantly wrapped box. Stella performed her signature gasp, a skill honed over 2 decades of being the center of attention. She untied the silk ribbon with theatrical slowness, her painted nails flashing in the firelight. Inside the box was a single, sleek car key with a large, ostentatious bow tied to it. "Arthur, you didn't," Stella whispered, her eyes wide with what looked, to the untrained eye, like genuine shock. My father allowed himself a rare, tight smile. "It's parked in the driveway. Hybrid model. Good mileage. We just wanted you to have something reliable, sweetie," Helen added, her hand fluttering to her chest. "And safe." The squeals and hugs that followed were deafening. Stella ran to the window, peering out at the new, pearl-white SUV gleaming in the driveway, a monument to their affection. I smiled. It was the smile I had perfected over years of such moments, a polite, supportive expression that cost me nothing and revealed even less. It was a muscular reflex, not an emotional one. Then, my mother turned to me. Her eyes softened with that particular brand of pitying sympathy she reserved for me. "Cora, honey, this one is from your father and me." She handed me a flat, business-sized envelope. It was crisp and white, my name printed on the front in a neat, sensible font. No ribbon, no glossy paper, just the stark efficiency of an office product. "We know how much you've been struggling to get your finances in order," she said gently, as if sharing a delicate secret. "We thought this might help you get on the right track." I slid my finger under the flap. Inside was a brochure and a gift certificate for a 1-year subscription to a premium financial planning service. The tagline on the front read, "Building a secure future, one sensible step at a time." Below it, in my father's sharp, decisive handwriting, was a small note, "It's time to be practical, Cora." I looked at the brochure, at the smiling, generic faces promising fiscal responsibility. I looked at Stella, who was now taking selfies with her new car keys. I looked at my parents, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of a job well done, of love generously and, in their eyes, appropriately distributed. They hadn't given me a lesser gift, they had given me a different one that was tailored to their perception of me, the sensible, struggling, slightly disappointing daughter who needed guidance, not grand gestures. The one who needed to be fixed. A silence fell around me, a pocket of stillness in the loud, happy room. In that silence, I felt the echoes of 1,000 other moments. I was 10, proudly presenting a collection of poems I'd written for my mother's birthday. She'd glanced at them, smiled vaguely, and said, "That's nice, dear," before turning her attention to helping Stella rehearse for her school play. I was 17, winning a statewide award for a historical mapping project I'd spent 6 months creating. They hadn't attended the ceremony. Stella had a ballet recital that same evening, a minor performance in a long line of them, but it had taken precedence. My father had texted me later, "Congratulations. We knew you had it in you." It was a statement of fact, not pride. They weren't cruel people. In their own minds, they were fair. They gave Stella the things she wanted: attention, applause, a stage. They gave me what they thought I needed: practicality, quiet encouragement to be more stable, a gentle push toward a life less artistic, less uncertain. The problem was, they had never once asked me what I wanted. They had simply mapped out my life based on their own limited understanding of my terrain, and in doing so, had erased the landscape that was actually there. I folded the gift certificate and slid it back into the envelope. I placed it on the small table beside my chair. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say anything at all. For the first time in my life, my silence wasn't passive. It was a boundary. And as I sat there, sipping my cooling cider, I felt a new kind of map taking shape inside me, not one of the past, but of the future. It was a map of a territory I had not yet explored, a place where I might finally draw my own borders. The call came 4 months later, on a Tuesday morning thick with spring rain. It was my mother. Her voice was laced with a carefully constructed helplessness that I recognized as her primary tool of persuasion. "Cora, darling, I know you're busy, but your father and I really need your help this weekend," she began, without any preamble. "We have to do a big clear-out at the cabin on Wimbrel Island. So many years of clutter. Your father's back is acting up, and I just can't manage those heavy boxes on my own." The cabin. My chest tightened. It was the one place where the geography of our family felt different. A small, cedar-shingled A-frame nestled among firs and madronas on the rocky shore of the island. It had been my grandmother's. After she passed, it became our shared inheritance. Unlike the house in the city, which was Helen and Arthur's stage, the cabin felt like neutral ground. It was where I had spent summers learning the names of wildflowers and watching seals from the porch. It smelled of wood smoke, salt, and old books. It was the only place where the silence felt like peace, not absence. "Stella would help, of course," Helen continued, her voice dropping conspiratorially, "but she's flying to Aspen for a wellness retreat. It's for her new lifestyle brand. Very important networking." The unspoken part of the sentence hung in the air between us. Stella is busy building a life. You, presumably, are not. Against my better judgment, I agreed. A part of me, the part that still craved the myth of a happy, functioning family, wanted to believe the request was genuine. Another, more cynical part knew it was a transaction, my labor in exchange for a temporary sense of belonging. That Saturday, I took the ferry to Wimbrel Island. The air was cool and damp, the sky a watercolor wash of gray. The cabin was just as I remembered it, but it felt neglected. A shutter hung slightly askew. The paint on the porch steps was peeling. Inside, dust lay thick on the familiar furniture. It felt like a place no one had truly loved in a long time. We worked all day. I hauled boxes of old linens and forgotten board games to my car to be taken to a donation center. Arthur sorted through his old fishing gear, his movements stiff and pained. Helen directed us, pointing out things to be kept or discarded, her voice echoing in the quiet rooms. By evening, we were exhausted. My parents retired to the main bedroom early, leaving me on the pull-out sofa in the living room. I couldn't sleep. The silence of the island, usually a comfort, felt heavy, pressing. I wandered into the small room my father used as an office, a space cluttered with tide charts and stacks of financial magazines. He was usually meticulous about locking the drawers of his antique writing desk, a habit I'd always found slightly paranoid. But that night, the top right drawer was slightly ajar. I don't know what compelled me to open it. Curiosity. A sense of unease that had been building all day. A quiet rebellion against a lifetime of being told not to pry. I slid the drawer open. It moved with a soft, woody sigh. Inside, beneath a stack of old bank statements, was a thick manila folder with a single word written on the tab in my father's handwriting, Cora. My heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. My hands trembled as I lifted the folder. Inside were documents, dozens of them, all neatly clipped together. The first was a property deed. I stared at it, my mind struggling to process the information. It was for a small cottage in the historic district of my city, a charming little place I'd often admired on my walks. The deed was dated 6 years ago. And the owner's name, typed in clear, black letters, was Cora Dean. My breath hitched. I'd never owned a cottage. I'd never had the money to even consider such a purchase. I flipped to the next page. It was a statement from a trust one didn't know existed, established with funds from my grandmother's estate, funds I had been told were modest and had been rolled into a small educational bond that had long since been depleted. Apparently, that wasn't the whole story. Then I saw the other papers. Bank statements for a rental account tied to the cottage, showing a steady stream of income for the past 5 years. And then, the documents that made the blood run cold in my veins, a series of fund transfer authorizations, moving significant sums of money from that rental account into a holding company I'd never heard of. Each one was signed with my name. It was my signature, but it wasn't. The loop of the C was too round, the tail of the too short. It was a careful, deliberate forgery. A ghost of my handwriting, created by someone who knew it well. I sank onto the small wooden chair, the papers spread before me on the desk. The soft hoot of an owl from the woods outside was the only sound. They hadn't just hidden an inheritance from me. They had used me. They had used my name, my identity, to build a secret financial structure I was never meant to discover. The practical, struggling daughter was, on paper, a property owner and the beneficiary of a trust. And the income from that life, my phantom life, had been siphoned away. I sat there for a long time, the truth of it settling over me not like a storm, but like a slow, creeping fog. It wasn't about the money. It was about the narrative. They had created a story of my incompetence to justify their control, while simultaneously using the resources they'd hidden from me to fund. What? The last document in the folder provided the answer. It was a loan agreement between their holding company and Stella's now defunct artisanal skincare business. The dates of the fund transfers from my rental account matched perfectly with the capital injections into her failed venture. They had used my inheritance to bankroll my sister's dreams. And then a final, devastating discovery tucked at the very back, a notice from a bank. It was a preliminary foreclosure warning. The loan they had taken out against the Wimbrel Island cabin, their treasured legacy, to cover Stella's final business losses, was in default. I carefully placed every paper back in the folder, slid it back into the drawer, and closed it. I walked back to the sofa bed and lay down, staring into the darkness. The geography of my family was not just a map of favoritism, but a landscape of deceit, with fault lines running so deep I was amazed the whole structure hadn't already crumbled. And in that moment, I knew I was no longer just a cartographer of other people's histories. I was about to redraw my own. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet, methodical action. The hurt, which had at first been a sharp, piercing pain, solidified into a cool, clear resolve. I wasn't interested in confrontation, in tearful accusations or dramatic scenes. That was their world, a stage for the grand emotions of Helen and Stella. My world was one of details, of data, of lines on a map. My revenge, if you could call it that, would be an act of cartography. I found a lawyer, a woman named Irene who specialized in estate and property law. She had sharp eyes and a calm, reassuring voice that cut through my emotional turmoil. I laid the copies of the documents I'd photographed on her polished mahogany desk. I didn't cry. I simply explained what I had found, my voice as steady as I could make it. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she steepled her fingers and looked at me. Cora, legally, this is fraud. We could sue for damages, press charges. It would be a messy, public fight. She paused, her gaze intent. But I get the sense that's not what you want. She was right. I didn't want to destroy them. I wanted to reclaim what was mine. I wanted to disentangle myself from the web they had woven around me. What I want, I said, my voice quiet but firm, is control. I want my cottage. I want the income from it. And I want to ensure that my name can never be used like this again. Irene nodded slowly. We can do that. It will be a silent coup, not a loud revolution. And so it began. The first step was to legally assert control over my assets. Irene drafted letters, filed papers, and within a month, the deed to the cottage was securely and officially in my possession, and the rental income was being deposited into a new bank account that only I could access. My parents received a legally binding notification from Irene's office, a dry, impersonal letter that informed them their management of the trust and property was terminated. I imagined my father reading it, his face impassive but his mind racing. I imagined my mother's confusion, her hurt questions. I received a single, clipped voicemail from my father. Cora, we need to talk. Call me. I didn't. Instead, I turned my attention to the second part of the map, the Wimbrel Island cabin. The foreclosure notice I'd found was preliminary. They still had a small window to save it, but I knew their financial situation. With Stella's business failure and the loss of the rental income from my cottage, they would be stretched thin. Using the back rent Irene had recovered for me and a small, carefully managed loan against my newly acquired cottage, I began the next phase of my plan. Irene helped me establish a shell corporation, an anonymous LLC with a name that meant nothing to anyone but me, Stillwater Holdings. It was a quiet, unassuming name for a quiet, unassuming entity. Through Stillwater Holdings, we contacted the bank that held the mortgage on the cabin. We made an offer to buy the debt. For a bank, a guaranteed payout from a mysterious but solvent LLC was far more attractive than a messy foreclosure on a family property. They accepted. The paperwork was complex, the process nerve-wracking. I signed documents as the sole director of Stillwater Holdings, my real signature, firm and clear, on every line. There were moments when a wave of panic washed over me. Was this too much? Too cold? But then I would remember the feel of that cheap envelope on Christmas morning, the casual dismissal in my father's handwriting, the lifetime of being made to feel small. This wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of self-preservation. 2 weeks before Christmas, the transaction was complete. Stillwater Holdings, which was to say, I was now the legal holder of the mortgage on the Wimbrel Island cabin. My parents had been paying their mortgage not to a bank, but to me. And they had no idea. The final step was the simplest. As the lien holder, I initiated the final stage of the foreclosure they had started. With them in default, the property deed was transferred to my LLC. It was all legal, all clean, all devastatingly final. I held the new deed in my hands, the paper cool and heavy. The owner of the cabin on Wimbrel Island was no longer Arthur and Helen Dean. It was me. My mother started texting me a week later. Cheerful, oblivious messages about Christmas plans. Are you bringing your famous gingerbread cookies? Stella found the most wonderful cashmere throw for the cabin. You'll love it. I replied with polite, non-committal answers. I was no longer an actor in their play, but I hadn't yet left the theater. The final act was yet to come, and I would be the one directing it. Christmas morning arrived, a near-perfect replica of the one before. The same scent of pine and cider, the same fire crackling in the hearth. Arthur stood by the mantel, his posture rigid. Helen fluttered about, her cheer feeling more brittle than it had a year ago. The unanswered phone calls and legal letters had created a subtle tension in the air, a low hum of anxiety beneath the festive noise. Stella swept in, lamenting a broken nail but otherwise radiant. The year had been kind to her. Her parents had clearly absorbed the financial shock of her failed business, shielding her from the consequences, as always. I placed my gift under the tree. It was in a simple, elegant gray box, tied with a single white ribbon. It was addressed to both of my parents. The morning unfolded in its usual sequence. Stella received a pair of diamond earrings and squealed on cue. I was given a set of expensive, hand-thrown ceramic mugs, a gift that felt like an apology and a question in one. I accepted them with a quiet, "Thank you." Then it was time. I picked up the gray box and handed it to my father. "This is for both of you." He took it, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. It was heavier than an envelope, more substantial than a gift certificate. Helen leaned in, her smile expectant. Arthur untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of white tissue paper, was a single, framed document. It was the new deed to the Wimbrel Island cabin. The name of the owner was clearly visible, Stillwater Holdings, LLC. Behind it was a second document, a single page detailing the legal ownership structure of the LLC, with my name, Cora Dean, as the sole director. And behind that, a final, polite, but unequivocal letter from Irene, stating that all access to the property was now at the owner's discretion. My father stared at the deed. His face, usually a mask of stoic control, seemed to slacken. The color drained from his cheeks. He read the second page, his eyes tracing the lines that led, inevitably, to my name. His hand, the one holding the frame, began to tremble, just slightly. "Arthur? What is it?" Helen asked, her voice bright with curiosity. She leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the document. The smile froze on her face, then slowly melted away, like frost on a windowpane. She looked from the paper to me, her expression one of utter, uncomprehending shock. "Cora, what is this?" Her voice was a whisper. I met her gaze. My own voice was calm, even, and free of all the things I thought I would feel: anger, triumph, bitterness. There was only a quiet clarity. "It's exactly what it looks like," I said. Stella looked back and forth between us, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What's going on? What is that?" No one answered her. The performance had stopped. The script was gone. My father sank into his armchair, the framed deed held loosely in his lap. He didn't look at me. He just stared at the paper, at the undeniable, black and white truth of it. Helen took a half step back from him, a small, involuntary movement of separation. A fissure had just opened in the foundation of their world, and she was already moving to the safer side. You lost the cabin," she said to him, her voice cracking. It wasn't an accusation. It was the sound of a story, told for 50 years, coming to an end. I stood up and walked to the closet to retrieve my coat. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire. It was the loudest silence I had ever heard. As I slipped on my coat, I spoke, not to any one of them, but to the room itself, to the history contained within its walls. "I have the keys," I said softly. "I will be changing the locks on Monday. Please arrange to have your personal belongings removed by then." I turned and walked to the door. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had already seen everything I needed to see. As I stepped outside, the cold, clean December air felt like a benediction. It was the first breath of a new life, in a new territory, a landscape I had finally claimed as my own. The snow began falling that evening, soft, fat flakes that drifted down and blanketed the world in a profound and gentle silence. I sat in an old wingback chair in the Wimbrel Island cabin, a thick wool blanket over my lap, a mug of tea growing cold on the table beside me. The fire I'd built in the stone hearth crackled and hissed, a warm and living heart in the quiet house. My house. The words still felt foreign, monumental. I looked around the familiar room, at the worn braided rug, the shelves of sun-faded books, the window that looked out onto the dark, churning water of the Sound. This place wasn't a prize I had won. It felt more like a part of myself I had reclaimed from a locked room. There was no sense of victory, no thrill of revenge. The hollowness I had expected to feel in their absence wasn't there. Instead, there was just peace. A quiet, expansive peace that filled all the spaces where anxiety and resentment used to live. I had spent my entire life trying to read the map they had drawn for me, trying to navigate a terrain that was never meant for me. In the end, the only solution was to draw a new one. I hadn't done it to hurt them. I had done it to save myself. I had done it to finally stop being the quiet, sensible daughter who would absorb their slights, fix their mistakes, and accept their narrative. The line I had drawn wasn't in anger, it was in self-respect. It was a border around my own sovereignty. I didn't know what would happen next. If Helen would eventually call, her voice thick with tears and carefully worded half-apologies. If Arthur would retreat into a stony silence, refusing to acknowledge the new reality. If Stella, for the first time in her life, would be forced to confront a truth that wasn't gilded for her benefit. Perhaps, one day, we would find a new way to be a family, on a new terrain with new borders. Or perhaps we wouldn't. I found, to my surprise, that I was at peace with either outcome. My worth was not something they could grant or withhold anymore. It was a territory I now owned outright. The snow continued to fall, erasing the hard edges of the world, making everything soft and new. I watched the flakes pile up on the porch railing, each one a tiny, perfect star, a silent testament to the beauty of a quiet descent. They weren't taking anything from me, not the cabin, not my name, not one more moment of my peace. They couldn't. I had taken it all back.